Chapter 2, Making of the Constitution. Demand for a Constituent Assembly. It was in 1934 that the idea of a Constituent Assembly for India was put forward for the first time by M. Roy, a pioneer of the communist movement in India. In 1935, the Indian National Congress (INC) for the first time officially demanded a Constituent Assembly to frame the Constitution of India. In 1938, Jawaharlal Nehru, on behalf of the INC, declared that the Constitution of Free India must be framed without outside interference by a Constituent Assembly elected on the basis of adult franchises. This view was endorsed and reiterated by the INC by passing a resolution in 1939. The demand was finally accepted in principle by the British government in what is known as the August Offer of 1940. In 1942, Sir Stafford Cripps, a member of the cabinet, came to India with a draft proposal of the British government on the framing of an independent constitution to be adapted after World War II. The Cripps proposals were rejected by the Muslim League, which wanted India to be divided into two autonomous states with two separate constituent assemblies. Finally, a cabinet mission. The cabinet mission, consisting of three members, Lord Patrick Lawrence, Sir Stafford Cripps, and A.V. Alexander, arrived in India on March 24, 1946. The cabinet mission published its plan on May 16, 1946. Finally, a cabinet mission was sent to India. While it rejected the idea of two constituent assemblies, it put forth a scheme for the Constituent Assembly which more or less satisfied the Muslim League. Composition of the Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly was constituted in November 1946 under the scheme formulated by the Cabinet Mission Plan. The features of the scheme were: the total strength of the Constituent Assembly was to be 389. Of this, 296 seats were to be allotted to British India and 93 seats to the princely states. Out of 296 seats allotted to British India, 292 members were to be drawn from the 11 governors' provinces. These include Madras, Bombay, UP, Bihar, Central Provinces, Orissa, Punjab, Northwestern Frontier Provinces, Sindh, Bengal, and Assam, and four from the four Chief Commissioners' provinces, one from each. These include Delhi, Ajmer, Merwara, Coorg, and British Balochistan. Each province and princely states or group of states, in case of small states, were to be allotted seats in proportion to their respective population. Roughly one seat was to be allotted for every million population. Seats allotted to each British province were to be divided among the three principal communities, Muslims, Sikhs, and General, all except Muslims and Sikhs, in proportion to their population. The representatives of each community were to be elected by members of that community in the provincial legislative assembly, and voting was to be by the method of proportional representation by means of single transferable vote. The representation of the princely states were to be nominated by the heads of the princely states. It is thus clear that the Constituent Assembly was to be a partly elected and partly nominated body. Moreover, the members were to be indirectly elected by the members of provincial assemblies, who themselves were elected on a limited franchise. The Government of India Act of 1935 granted limited franchises on the basis of tax, property, and other qualifications. The elections to the Constituent Assembly for 296 seats allotted to the British Indian provinces were held in July to August 1946. The Indian National Congress won 208 seats, the Muslim League 73 seats, and the small groups and the independents got the remaining 15 seats. However, the 93 seats allotted to the princely states were not filled, as they decided to stay away from the Constituent Assembly. Although the Constituent Assembly was not directly elected by the people of India on the basis of adult franchises, the Assembly comprised representatives from all sections of Indian society: Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Parsis, Anglo-Indians, Indian Christians, SCs, STs, including women of all these sections. The Assembly included all important personalities of time all important personalities of India at the time, with the exception of Mahatma Gandhi. The allocation of seats in the Constituent Assembly, the results of the election to the Constituent Assembly, the community-wise representation in the Constituent Assembly, and the women members of the Constituent Assembly are mentioned in the text. Okay. Working of the Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly held its first meeting on December 9, 1946. The Muslim League boycotted the meeting and insisted on a separate state of Pakistan. The meeting was thus attended by only 207 members. Dr. Sachidananda Sinha, the oldest member, was elected as the temporary chairman of the assembly following the French practice. On December 11, 1946, Dr. Rajendra Prasad was elected as the permanent chairman, president of the assembly. Similarly, on January 25, 1947, H. C. Mukherjee was elected as the vice president of the assembly. Later on, the assembly resolved to have two vice presidents. Accordingly, on July 16, 1947, V. T. Krishnamachari was elected as the second vice president of the assembly. Objective resolutions. On December 13, 1946, Jawaharlal Nehru moved the historic objective resolution in the assembly. It laid down the fundamentals and philosophy of the constitutional structure. It read, "This constituent assembly declares its firm and solemn resolve to proclaim India as an independent sovereign republic and to draw up for her future governance a constitution, wherein the territory that now comprise British India, the territories that now form the Indian states, and such other parts of India as are outside India, and the states as well as other territories as are willing to be constituted in the independent sovereign India, shall be union of them all, and wherein the said territories were with their present boundaries or with such other as may be determined by the Constituent Assembly, and thereafter, according to the law of the Constitution, shall possess and retain the status of autonomous units, together with residuary powers, and exercise all powers and functions of government and administration, save and except such powers and functions as are vested in or assigned to the Union, or as are inherent or implied in the Union or resulting therefrom, and wherein all power and authority of the sovereign independent India, its constituent parts and organs of government are derived from the people, and wherein shall be guaranteed and secured to all the people of India justice, social, economic, and political, equality of status and status of opportunity and before the law, freedom of thought, expression, belief, faith, worship, vocation, association, and action, subject to law and public morality, and wherein adequate safeguards shall be provided for minorities, backward and tribal areas, and depressed and other backward classes, and whereby shall be maintained the integrity of the territory of the Republic and its sovereign rights on land, sea, and air, according to justice and the law of civilized nations. And this ancient land attains its rightful and honored place in the world and makes its full and willing contribution to the promotion of world peace and welfare of mankind. This resolution was unanimously adopted by the Assembly on January 22, 1947. It influenced the eventual shaping of the Constitution through all its subsequent stages. Its modified version forms the preamble of the present Constitution. Changes by the Independence Act. The representatives of the princely states who had stayed away from the Constituent Assembly gradually joined it. On April 28, 1947, representatives of the 6 states, these include Baroda, Bikaner, Jaipur, Patiala, Rewa, and Udaipur, were part of the assembly. After the acceptance of the Mountbatten Plan of June 3, 1947, for the partition of the country, the representatives of most of the other princely states took their seats in the assembly. The members of the Muslim League from the Indian Dominion also entered the assembly. The Indian Independence Act of 1947 made the following 3 changes in the position of the assembly. The assembly was made a fully sovereign body which could frame any constitution it pleased. The act empowered the assembly to abrogate or alter any law made by the British Parliament in relation to India. The assembly also became a legislative body. In other words, two separate functions were assigned to the assembly, that is, making of the constitution for free India and enacting of ordinary laws for the country. These two tasks were to be performed on separate days. Thus, the assembly became the first parliament of free India, Dominion legislature, where whenever the assembly met as the constitutional body, it was chaired by Dr. Rajendra Prasad, and when it met as a legislature body, it was chaired by G.V. Mavalankar. These two functions continued till November 26, 1949, when the task of making the constitution was over. For the first time, the Constituent Assembly met as Dominion Legislature on November 17, 1947, and elected G.V. Mavalankar as its member, as its speaker. The Muslim League members, hailing from the areas included in the Pakistan. These were West Punjab, East Bengal, Northwest Frontier Province, Sindh, Balochistan, and Silkit district of Assam. A separate Constituent Assembly was set up for Pakistan, withdrew the Constituent Assembly for India. Consequently, the total strength of the Assembly came down to 299 as against 389, originally fixed in 1946 under the Cabinet Mission Plan. The strength of the Indian provinces, formerly British provinces, was reduced from 296 to 229, and those of the princely states from 93 to 70. The state-wise membership of the Assembly as on December 31, 1947 is shown in the table. Okay. Other functions preferred, functions performed. In addition to the making of the constitution and enacting of ordinary laws, the Constituent Assembly also performed the following functions. It ratified India's membership of the Commonwealth in May 1949. It adopted the national flag on July 22, 1947. It adopted the national anthem on January 24, 1950. It adopted the national song on January 24, 1950. It elected Dr. Rajendra Prasad as the first President of India on January 24, 1950. In all, the Constituent Assembly had 11 sessions over 2 years, 11 months and 18 days. The constitution makers had gone through the constitutions of about 60 countries, and the draft constitution was considered for 114 days. The total expenditure incurred on making the constitution amounted to rupees 64 lakh. On January 24, 1950, the Constituent Assembly held its final session. It, however, did not end and continued as the Provincial Parliament of India from January 26, 1950 till the formation of new Parliament after the first general election in 1951 to 52. The Provincial Parliament ceases to exist on April 17, 1952. The first elected Parliament with the two houses came into being in May 1952. The complete list of the sessions of the Constituent Assembly is given in table. Committees of the Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly appointed a number of committees to deal with different tasks of constitution making. Out of this, 8 were major committees and the others were minor committees. The name of these committees and their chairman are given below. Major committees: Union Powers Committee, Jawaharlal Nehru; Union Constitution Committee, Jawaharlal Nehru; Provincial Constitution Committee, Sardar Patel; Drafting Committee, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar; Advisory Committee on Fundamental Rights, Minorities and Tribal and Excluded Areas, Sardar Patel. These committees had the following 5 subcommittees: Fundamental Rights Subcommittee, J.P. Kirupalani; Minorities Subcommittee, H.C. Mukherjee; Northeast Frontier Tribal Areas and Assam Excluded and Partially Excluded Areas Subcommittee, Gopinath Bardoloi; Excluded and Partially Excluded Areas other than those in Assam Subcommittee, A.V. Thakur; Northwest Frontier Tribal Areas Subcommittee. One of the political consequences of the British government statement on June 3, 1947 was that following a referendum, the Northwest Frontier Province and Balochistan became part of the territory of the Dominion of Pakistan, and as a result, the tribal areas in this region became a concern of that domain. The subcommittee on the tribal areas in the Northwest Frontier Province and Balochistan was not therefore called upon to function on behalf of the Constituent Assembly of India, B. Shivaji Rao, the framing of India's Constitution. The members of this subcommittee were Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, Khan Abdul Samad Khan and Meher Chand Khanna. The information about the chairman is not found. Rules of Procedure Committee, Dr. Rajendra Prasad. State States Committee, Committee for Negotiating with States. States Committee, Committee for Negotiating with States, Jawaharlal Nehru. Shearing Committee, Dr. Rajendra Prasad. Minor committees, Finance and Staff Committee, Dr. Rajendra Prasad. Credentials Committee, Alladi Krishnaswamy Iyer. House Committee, B. Patabi Sitaramaya. Order of Business Committee, Dr. K. M. Munshi. Hagok Committee on the National Flag, Dr. Rajendra Prasad. Committee on the Functions of the Constituent Assembly, G. V. Mavalankar. Arho Committee on the Supreme Court, S. Varadachari, not an assembly member. Committee on Chief Commissioners Provinces, P. Patabi Sitaramaya. Expert Committee on the Financial Provisions of the Union Constitution, Nalini Rajan Sarkar, not an assembly member. Linguistic Provinces Commission, S.K. Dar, not an assembly member. Special Committee to examine the draft constitution, Jawaharlal Nehru. Press Gallery Committee, Usha Nath Sen. Ad hoc Committee on Citizenship, S. Varadachari, not an assembly member. Drafting Committee. Among all the committees of the Constituent Assembly, the most important committee was the Drafting Committee, set up on August 29, 1947. It was this committee that was entrusted with the task of preparing a draft of the new constitution. It consists of 7 members. They were Dr. B. R. Ambedkar, Chairman, N. Gopalaswamy Iyengar, Alladi Krishnaswamy Iyer, Dr. K. M. Munshi, Syed Muhammad Sadullah, N. Madhavarao. He replaced B. N. Miller, who resigned due to ill health. T.T. Krishnamachari. He replaced D.P. Kaitan, who died in 1948. The Drafting Committee, after taking into consideration the proposal of the various committees, prepared the first draft of the Constitution of India, which was published in February 1948. The people of India were given 8 months to discuss the draft and propose amendments in light of the public comments, criticism and suggestions. The Drafting Committee prepared a second draft, which was published in October 1948. The Drafting Committee took less than 6 months to prepare its draft. In all, it sat only for 141 days. Enactment of the Constitution. Dr. B. R. Ambedkar introduced the final draft of the Constitution in the Assembly on November 4, 1948. First reading. The Assembly had a general discussion on it for 5 days till November 9, 1948. The second reading, clause by clause consideration, started on November 15, 1948 and ended on October 17, 1949. During this stage, as many as 7,653 amendments were proposed and 2,473 were actually discussed in the Assembly. The third reading of the draft started on November 14, 1949. Dr. B. R. Ambedkar moved a motion, the Constitution as settled by the Assembly be passed. The motion on draft Constitution was declared as passed on November 26, 1949 and received the signature of the members and the President. Out of a total 299 members of the Assembly, only 284 were actually present on that day and signed the Constitution. This is also the date mentioned in the preamble as the date on which the people of India in the Constituent Assembly adapted, enacted and gave to themselves this Constitution. The Constitution as adapted on November 26, 1949 contained a preamble, 359 articles and 8 schedules. The preamble was enacted after the entire Constitution was already enacted. The preamble was enacted after the entire Constitution was already enacted. Dr. B. R. Ambedkar, the then Law Minister, piloted the draft Constitution in the Assembly. He took a very prominent part in the deliberating of the Assembly. He was known for his logical, forceful and pervasive arguments on the floor of the Assembly. He is recognized as the father of the Indian Constitution. This brilliant writer, constitutional expert and undisputed leader of the scheduled castes, he is also known as the chief architect of the Constitution of India. On November 19, 2015, the Government of India has declared to celebrate the November 26th of every year as the Constitution Day, Samvidhan Divas, to promote constitutional values among citizens. Enforcement of the Constitution. Some provisions of the Constitution pertaining to citizenship, elections, provincial parliament, temporary and transitional provisions, and the short title contained in Article 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 60, 324, 366, 367, 379, 380, 388, 391, 392 and 393 came into force on November 26, 1949 itself. The remaining provisions, the major part of the Constitution, came into force on January 26, 1950. This day is referred to in the Constitution as the date of its commencement and is celebrated as the Republic Day. January 26 was specifically chosen as the date of commencement of the Constitution because of its historical importance. It was on this day in 1930 the Purna Swaraj Day was celebrated following the resolution of the Lahore session December 1929 of the INC. With the commencement of the Constitution, the Indian Independence Act of 1947, the Indian Independence Act of 1947 and the Government of India Act of 1935 with all enactment amending or supplementing the latter act were repealed. The abolition of Privy Council Jurisdiction Act 1949 was however continued. Experts Committee of the Congress. While election to the Constituent Assembly was still in progress, on July 8, 1946, the Congress Party, Indian National Congress, appointed an experts committee for the purpose of preparing material for the Constituent Assembly. This committee consists of the following members: Jawaharlal Nehru, Chairman; M. Asaf Ali, K. Munshi, N. Gopalaswamy Iyengar, K. T. Shah, D. R. Gadkil, Humayun Kabir, and K. Sandanam. Later on, the chairman's proposal was resolved that Krishna Kirbalini too co-opted as member and convener of the committee. The committee had two sittings. The first at New Delhi from July 1946, and the second at Bombay from August 15 to 17, 1946. Apart from a number of notes prepared by its members, the committee discussed the procedure to be adopted by the Constituent Assembly, the question of the appointment of various committees, and the draft of the resolution on the objectives of the Constitution to be moved during the first session of the Constituent Assembly, on the role played by its committee in the making of the Constitution. Gramainal Astin, an American constitutional expert, observed it was the Congress Experts Committee that set India on the road to her present constitution. The committee members, working within the framework of the cabinet mission scheme, made general suggestions about autonomous areas and the power of provincial governments and the center, and about such issues as the princely states and the amending power. They also drafted a resolution closely resembling the Objectives Resolution. The criticism of the Constituent Assembly. The critics have criticized the Constituent Assembly on various grounds. These are as follows: not a representative body. The critics have argued that the Constituent Assembly was not a representative body as its members were not directly elected by the people of India on the basis of universal adult franchise. Not a sovereign body, the critics maintained that the Constituent Assembly was not a sovereign body as it was created by the proposals of the British government. Further, they said that the Assembly held its sessions with the permission of the British government, time consuming. According to the critics, the Constituent Assembly took an unduly long time to make the Constitution. They stated that the framers of the American Constitution took only 4 months to complete their work. In this context, Naseeruddin Ahmad, a member of the Constituent Assembly, coined a new name for the drafting committee to show his contempt for it. He called it a drifting committee. The time taken by the framers of the other constitution is given in table. Dominated by Congress. The critics charged that the Constituent Assembly was dominated by the Congress party. In this context, Gravin Augustine, an American constitutional expert, remarked the Constituent Assembly was a one-party body in an essentially one-party country. The Assembly was the Congress and the Congress was India. Lawyer-politician domination. It is also maintained by the critics that the Constituent Assembly was dominated by lawyers and politicians. They pointed out that other sections of the society were not sufficiently represented. This of them is the main reason for the bulkiness and complicated language of the Constitution. Dominated by Hindus. According to some critics, the Constituent Assembly was a Hindu-dominated body. Lord Viscount Simon called it a body of the Hindus. Similarly, Winston Churchill commented that the Constituent Assembly represented only one major community in India. Important facts. The elephant was adopted as a symbol, seal of the Constituent Assembly. Sir B.N. Rao was appointed as a legal advisor to the Constituent Assembly. H.B.R. Iyengar was the secretary to the Constituent Assembly. S.N. Mukherjee was the chief draftsman of the Constitution in the Constituent Assembly. Prem Bihari Narani Raisada was the calligrapher of the Indian Constitution. The original Constitution was handwritten by him in a flowing italic style. The original version was beautified and decorated by artists from Santiniketan, including Nandlal Bose and Verohar Ram Manohar Singha. Verohar Ram Manohar Singha illuminated, beautified and ornamented the original preamble calligraphed by Prem Bihari Narayan Raisada. The calligraphy of the Hindi version of the original constitution was done by Vasant Krishnan Vaidya and elegantly decorated and illuminated by Nandlal Bose. Hindi text of the constitution. Originally, the Constitution of India did not make any provision with respect to an authoritative text of the constitution in the Hindi language. Later, a provision in this regard was made by the 58th Constitutional Amendment Act of 1987. This amendment inserted a new article 394A in the last part of the constitution, that is part 22. This article contains the following provisions. The President shall cause to be published under his authority the translation of the constitution in Hindi language. The modifications wherever necessary to bring it in conformity with the language, style and terminology adapted in the authoritative text of the central acts in Hindi can be made in it. All the amendments of the constitution made before such publication should be incorporated in it. The translation in Hindi of every amendment of the constitution made in English. The translation of the constitution and every amendment published shall be construed to have the same meaning as the original text in English. If any difficulty arises in this manner, the President shall cause the Hindi text to be revised suitably. The translation of the Constitution and its every amendment published shall be deemed to be, for all purposes, the authoritative text in Hindi.